Thank you, Wayne. Good to see everybody tonight, as usual, and hope our discussion as we begin Acts chapter 10 will be helpful, informative, and encouraging as we talk about Cornelius and his life and eventual conversion toward the end of Acts chapter 10. We read the first, I think we read the first 15 or 16 verses, so we won't go back and read those. We will read some more as we go along tonight. But I want to look at the first 7 or 8 verses beginning. We talked about Cornelius, a certain man in Caesarea, lived in Caesarea named Cornelius. Caesarea, B.W. Johnson says, at this time was the chief seaport of Palestine and the Roman capital. It was their military headquarters. Cornelius was a Roman officer, Roman soldier. Centurion indicates in charge of 100 men. He's one of the four centurions that are mentioned in the Bible. This was kind of interesting to me, that one of the 4 that's mentioned favorably in the Bible, along with, let me just name these real quick. Julius. We won't turn and read this, but in Acts chapter 27, the first 9 or 10 verses talks about Julius, that you remember on this occasion in Acts chapter 27 where Paul was on his voyage to Rome, then he was going to be under house arrest. He had appealed to Caesar, and so he was going to be before Caesar at some point in time. And so on this trip, and I think, was it 276 people aboard that ship, I believe, if I recall correctly. But the first 9 to 10 verses, the first 3 or 4 verses particularly mentions one of the soldiers guarding him named Julius. And it said that he gave him leave to be amongst his friends and so forth and so on. In other words, he gave him a certain amount of freedom. So he wasn't just a hard-nosed kind of thing. So he's pictured as one of the 4 in the scriptures. Said the scriptures say he courteously entreated Paul. So he gave him leave to go amongst his friends and so forth. You remember the centurion at the cross. There are 2 or 3 verses about him. I just mentioned the one in Mark 15 and verse 39, when the Bible says that Jesus gave up the ghost. The centurion said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And one of the scriptures say this was a righteous man. In the Mark's account, he says, "Truly, this was the Son of God." So that was the second one that's mentioned. Of course, Cornelius is another one. We'll get into him in just a second. And then the centurion who built the synagogue at Capernaum. We won't go back and read all of this, but it's found in Luke chapter 7. About the first 9 to 10 verses, it talks about that this man was worthy. He had a servant who was sick, and he found out that Jesus was in the neighborhood, and he asked Jesus to come heal his servant. And then later on, he kind of changed his mind and said, "If you don't have to come. I'm a man under authority too, and if you'll just speak the word, I know that my servant will be healed." And Jesus did. And then Jesus made the comment about him, "I've not found so great faith, no, not in Israel." Talking about this particular centurion. And then, of course, the 4th one is the one we're speaking of tonight, is Cornelius. So the office, Johnson says, corresponded kind of to our modern captain, but he also mentions, when he mentions he was the band called the Italian band. He said that a lot of the enemies that Rome captured, they would put different ones in charge, and he said he could have been in charge of as many as 600. The other people say he was in charge of 100, centurion or century, meaning in charge of 100. But he said an Italian cohort was composed of about 600 men. And some of these were conquered races that served in the Roman armies. So I don't know whether he was actually in charge of 100 or in charge of 600. It's debatable. Doesn't really matter. Probably 100 is what most think about. And notice how he's pictured there, beginning in verse 2. A devout man, and one of the, later on in here, he's called a just man. So the word just is used to describe him. A devout man, one that feared God with all his house, gave much alms to the people, and prayed to God always. So this was a very spiritual man. Whether he was saved or not, and I'm going to read this later on, we won't get to it tonight, but when we get through with these 48 verses, I want to read McGarvey's comments on this, and I want to read Mac Deaver's comments on this, because when I talked to Mac about Cornelius, he said without a doubt he was saved. Of course, we know that in Acts 11, verse 14, it says that when Peter is recalling this, look at that just a minute. He said, Peter, who shall tell thee words whereby thou and all thy house shall be saved. Mac takes the view that he was saved from the system that he was under, because this is the first time he was amenable, and I talked to you guys about this, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks ago, about the gospel is going to be preached in Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. And nobody was amenable to it until they had the opportunity to receive it. And once Paul declared in Colossians 1, verse 6 and Colossians 1, verse 23, that the gospel had been preached to the whole world, everybody from that point in time, which would have been around 62 or 63 AD or thereabouts, if we look at when Colossians was written, would be amenable to the gospel. Cornelius, according to Mac, and I'll read a detailed thing there the next week or so, talked about the fact that he was under moral law, or the law that he was under was the Gentiles who were a law unto themselves. And in Romans 2, 14 and 15, where it talks about whether you were accused or excused under the law, this particular point. We've always been taught that Cornelius was a lost man. And that's the way we grew up, Lloyd, that no matter how good he was lost.
Well, Max said also that Abraham lived under that same law.
Under the law, yeah, under that law.
He was saved.
Yeah. So at any rate, be that as may, I just want to make sure that you understood that was a different opinion. Everybody else believes that Cornelius was a lost man. B.W. Johnson, Wayne Jackson, McGarvey, and I'll read something about Jackson. I may not get to it tonight, but I'll read what Jackson says about it as well. But at any rate, he was a fine, upstanding man by all accounts, regardless, a great man, somebody that had his house under control, his house, not just himself, but all of those in his family believed God, feared God. He gave much alms to the people, very generous man, prayed to God, he was devout, he was just. So he was a great man in a lot of ways, but a benevolent man and a man of prayer. So he saw the vision in verse 3 about the 9th hour, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, one of the Jewish hours of prayer. So he asked the question in verse 4, "What is it, Lord?" So he was filled with awe. He inquired the meaning of the appearance. And he was told, "Your prayers and your alms are come up for a memorial before God." So he was heard. Another thing that we've always heard is God doesn't hear sinners' prayers. So that's another tidbit, and there are various verses in Old Testament, New Testament that indicate that. So, but at any rate, his prayers came up for a memorial and a remembrance to God. Certainly he was seeking the truth. He was yearning for the truth, wanted to know the truth. So he was told to send to Joppa. Now he's in Caesarea. Joppa is about 30 miles south of Caesarea. So he's not told to go himself, but you send a soldier or others, because a soldier could not leave their post. He was a centurion. But you send to Joppa, about 30 miles south of Caesarea, to Simon. In verse 5, call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodges with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell thee what thou oughtest to do. So, Simon the tanner, whose house is by the seaside, it was kind of interesting. I found something that I think it was, let me see just real quick. I want to say it was Johnson, but it may have been Jackson. Let me see if I can find it. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was B.W. Johnson that said this. Let me go back. Let's see. It was by the seaside, where he lived by the seaside. In Acts 10:32 is mentioned again, and said that Dean Stanley. This is B.W. Johnson quoting Dean Stanley, says that there is a house there that's still pointed out close to the seashore as that of Simon, which Dean Stanley believes to be the original site. Now, whether the house is the original site or not, but that whether it is or isn't. But B.W. Johnson was writing this in the 1890s or thereabouts, and he said that Dean Stanley, and I'm not sure, I know the name Dean Stanley, but I'm not sure if he's a Bible scholar or somebody that researches that sort of thing, says there's a house there, supposedly on the same site of where Simon the tanner lived. So verse 7, two of his household servants, a devout soldier. And then in verse 9, on the morrow, as they drew nigh to the city, so starting in the evening, sometime after 3 o'clock, they could be, because if he received the vision at 3 o'clock, they could be near Joppa, 30 miles distant, the next day without any trouble. The next day at the 6th hour, about 12 o'clock. And he went up on the housetop to pray to the flat of the house. Those houses in those days, as Moses commanded, had a balustrade around them about 4 feet high. And that's where sometimes, depending on the weather, that some of the family would sleep in that area during the warm season, would go up on the roof, on the housetop and so forth, to sleep or to relax or whatever. I think that's kind of where David was when he saw Bathsheba, wasn't it? He was up on the roof and saw her. Yeah. So he saw her from wherever he was, that he could look across and see Bathsheba, which got him in trouble, right, Bill? So, but Moses talked about this in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 8. Also, it's mentioned in 1 Samuel 9 and verse 25 about the balustrades, or the 4 foot, about a 4 foot kind of railing around the flat roof of the house and so forth. About that time, he fell into a trance. You guys feel free to speak up any time now. I failed to mention that. Fell into a trance where he was transported, as Johnson says, out of himself into a mental condition that fitted him to see divine things. There are at least 2 other examples of this in the Scripture. You remember, Keith talked about this when he was discussing 2 Corinthians. You remember the occasion of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:2 that talked about he saw a man, whether in the body or out of the body, and he mentions that a couple of different times. He said, I don't know, that caught up into the third heaven and so forth. And of course, he's talking about himself, saw things that it was not lawful for him to repeat and so forth. And then we have the example of John on the Isle of Patmos in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10, where he was described, or he describes himself, that I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So exactly what that entailed, I'm not sure, but something similar to this vision that Cornelius had, because John certainly saw things that certain things were revealed to him of things that's going to be shortly coming to pass, as it said there in Revelation chapter 1. So he saw heaven open there in verse 11. And Johnson says that the meaning of the vision is plain, that Peter was hungry. He saw let down from heaven all kinds of animals, those ceremoniously unclean, and of course others too. These unclean animals were of course prohibited by Mosaic law, but he was told to kill and eat. When he answered that he had never eaten anything common or unclean, in other words, he had never eaten anything that was forbidden by Moses to eat, so he was a strict Jew, that he was abiding by the laws of the clean or unclean, what you could eat and what you couldn't eat at that point in time that was forbidden by Moses. He was told that what God has cleansed was not common or unclean. And of course, this could only mean that the ceremonial distinctions between the law were done away with. Of course, he didn't understand that at that particular point in time. He did later on. Of course, this was done 3 different times. He finally got the message. But it was at this time that the messengers from this Gentile, from Cornelius, the Gentiles, of course, a class with which even Peter would not eat, yet for which Christ had died, presented themselves. And as Johnson says, that the object of the vision was to show Peter that it was will of the Lord that he should go. This was done in verse 16. This was done 3 different times. The voice spoke to him 3 different times. So he finally got the word about this. And it's interesting as we go on and read more about Peter. You remember that Jesus had told him in Matthew 16 that I'm going to give to you, Peter, the keys to the kingdom. You're going to open the doors to the kingdom. And sometimes we think of it in terms of the Jews on the day of Pentecost, which certainly that was the first occasion in Acts chapter 2, that he opened the door of the gospel to the Jews in Acts chapter 2. But the interesting thing is, he also opened the door to the Gentiles. So he was a very prominent man in the first century in the early church, because he had the keys to the kingdom, both to the Jews and to the Gentiles, even though later on we know that Paul would become the apostle to the Gentiles, even though Paul preached to the Jews as well, and Peter preached to the Gentiles as well. But Peter was the apostle, of course, to the Jews, Paul to the Gentiles, but Peter's the one that opened the door in both cases. Charlie?
Well, in 1 John 5:6, it says, it is the Spirit that bears witness, because the Spirit is truth.
Spirit is truth, that's right. So much about the word truth there. Thy word is truth, John 17:17. Other passages there, as you mentioned, in the Spirit being truth as well. Absolutely.
It's
Matter of fact,
interesting that,
go ahead, Lloyd.
it's interesting that it was an angel that went and spoke to Cornelius.
Yep.
And hearing his trance, he heard a voice. I just wondered if it was the voice of an angel or if it was Christ himself that he heard.
Yeah.
Doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, I'm not really sure on that, Lloyd. The interesting thing about the angel, you remember we mentioned a while ago, John on the Isle of Patmos. There later on in Revelation, it talks about this angel that came to him and spoke to him in Revelation 22, down about verse 9, I think it is, Revelation 22:9 or thereabouts. That John fell down before the angel, to worship the angel, and he said, "No, I'm your fellow servant." Basically told him to get up. I'm like you. I'm your fellow servant in a sense. And then the last part there of, I think it's Revelation 22:9, he said, "Worship God." So even an angel was not to be worshipped, and he plainly points that out. And of course, Paul had a similar experience, didn't he, where they thought he was a god. When you remember when the serpent, it was snake bitten, and they thought he would going to fall down dead, and he didn't. And thought he was a god, and said, no, that's not the case. Yeah, I'm not sure on that, Lord, on
Well, it doesn't matter
on which it was, but
one of
it's,
them.
it is
just thought
interesting.
that each one of them called the person Lord.
Yeah,
But the term Lord was sometimes used to anyone in higher authority.
a higher authority. Yeah, term of respect. Matter of fact, what you remember when Saul on the road to Damascus, who are you, Lord? He hadn't recognized him as Jesus. I'm Jesus whom you persecute. So Jesus identified himself, but he didn't know, like Lord said, it was a term of endearment or a term of respect, somebody that's above you in that particular scenario. Scott, do you have a thought of
Sarah also referred to
Abraham?
as Lord.
Yeah,
I tried that a couple of times, and that didn't work out.
didn't work out good. No, it wouldn't work in my house. So I don't.
We're not gonna try that on Gene.
Say, Jeannie,
If I'm not here Sunday, I don't know why.
said you're somebody like Sarah. The Bible describes you in 1 Peter 3 like Sarah, that Sarah called Abraham Lord. What
I
about
know
it?
what you do.
Probably wouldn't work too well, Lord.
I've known the past.
And then down verse 17, it uses the word doubted. That word, again, doesn't necessarily mean that he doubted what the Lord said. It was in terms of what was the object of all of this. In other words, he was kind of wondering what it was all about. Not that he doubted, but it says, now while Peter doubted it himself, notice what this vision which he has seen should mean. In other words, he wasn't doubting the Lord. He was concerned about what does this actually mean. So the word doubted didn't mean that he was doubting the messenger. He just wasn't sure what is the object of this. What do you want me to do? Kind of like Paul, what would you have me to do, kind of thing. So it's while he was thinking over the matter that the messengers came. The Spirit told him their purpose and what he must do. It's kind of interesting when Lord was talking about it, an angel spoke to him. You remember, even when Jesus spoke to Saul of Tarsus, he didn't tell him what to do. And that's kind of significant when you get to thinking about it. So all of those from Pentecost on, they had to have, and Keith had mentioned, I think in one of his classes, it was in earthen vessels that somebody had to tell him. In other words, Paul had to get Saul of Tarsus, somebody had to get his attention, and he certainly got the attention with the bright light, and because he was so steeped in the Jewish religion and the Pharisees, and I've lived in all good conscience before God, and I'm going to stamp out this sect and all this. Jesus said he was a chosen vessel to me, but had he not appeared to him that way, you kind of wonder whether Saul would have ever. In other words, he had to have something miraculous to get his attention. He got his attention, but Jesus didn't tell him. You go in the city and it'll be told you what to do. And here Cornelius, even though he's a devout man, just man, prayed to God, much on, great man, he was going to be told by an earthen vessel what to do. So he made inquiry there in verse 17. The men which were sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house, stood before the gate, and called and asked whether Simon, which was surnamed Peter, were lodged there. Verse 18. So the call to the men took care of them till the next day. They returned with him. 6 Jewish brethren from Joppa went with him, and when he's recalling this in Acts chapter 11, it's mentioned in Acts chapter 11, verse 12. So he was told to go with these men. Verse 20. Then Peter went down to the men which were sent unto him, verse 21, from Cornelius, and said, Behold, I'm he whom you seek. What is the cause wherefore ye are come? Now he had had this vision, but he still didn't know the full import of what the situation was. He's going to perceive this later on, when he's going to talk about this, that I perceive that in every nation, one that fears God and works righteousness is accepted with him. So he was finally convinced. But here he still doesn't know what the mission is. I'm here, verse 21. Why did you send for me? What is the cause that you're come? They said, Cornelius, the centurion, notice how he's described again, a just man. Later on, earlier, he was described as a devout man. Here, a just man, one that feareth God, of good report among all the nation of the Jews, was warned from God by, as Lord mentioned, an holy angel to send for thee into his house and to hear words of thee. Then called he them in and lodged them, and on the morrow Peter went away with them, and certain brethren from Joppa accompanied him. In verse 23. So, and I think that was the 6 Jewish brethren that we just mentioned that from Joppa that went with him. And the morning after, there in verse 24, they entered into Caesarea. So they'd gone from Joppa to Caesarea, about 30 miles away. So took them parts of 2 days to get there that were employed in the journey. And that Cornelius had called together his brethren and his near friends who were like-minded with himself. So these were people that were also God-fearing people, devout, as it were. So verse 25, Cornelius met him, fell down at his feet. In verse, let me get my thought. Verse 25, and worshiped him. But Peter, if it was today, what would happen if that were to occur? If Peter was the first pope, which the religious world or the Catholic world, describes or ascribes to him that he was the first pope. Of course, he was married, so that kind of would negate that probably too, wouldn't it? But notice what Peter said. Stand up. I myself also am a man. You're not going to worship me. You worship God. He didn't put it in so many words, but I'm a man. You stand up. And as he talked with him, he went in and found many that were come together. So Cornelius had gathered a lot of people together, his friends, his family, and so forth. In verse 27, you know that it is unlawful or contrary to Jewish customs. In other words, Moses prohibited intermarriages, the Jews and Gentiles and so forth, and other religious intercourse or religious gatherings, as it were. But as so often was the case, the Jews carried their restrictions beyond both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. You remember even Jesus chastised them many times about, you count the smallest herbs and spices and so forth, 9 for me and 1 for God, and nine of this and 1 for this. He said you tithe, you do all these things, but then they took it beyond the 10 Commandment law. I'd heard one time, and I think one of y'all might have used this, Bill might have used it, Keith might have used it, that there were, if you go back and look in the history of the Jews, the 1,500-year history of the Jews, that the 10 Commandments went from 10 to 613. I've heard that number somewhere. It went to 613. In other words, the very smallest thing where if your ox falls in a ditch, you couldn't pull it out and so forth, even though a lot of them violated that law and everything. Jesus chastised them and others on situations such as that. So they took it way beyond the 10 Commandment law. As a matter of fact, it's interesting too that Jesus boiled it down to 2. You had the 10 that went to 613 with the Jews. When Jesus was asked about the great commandment in the law, what did he say?
Honor your father and honor your neighbor as yourself.
Only 2, right? Kind of boiled it down. On these 2 laws hang all the laws of the prophet. The Jews went the other way with it. Jesus boiled it down to 2, the 10 to 2, So Peter, as a matter of fact, even after this, the interesting thing is, even after Peter was convinced that the Gentiles were accepted, what happened to him in Galatians chapter 2 later on? Keith, what was the year or years in Galatians? Was it 61 or 62 AD, something like that?
It depends on when it fell. If it was written, I think it was written right before the book of Romans.
Okay.
Romans was written around 58.
58?
I think it was 57 maybe.
Okay.
Galatians was written.
All right, so you got roughly 25 years after Christ's death and resurrection that Peter lapsed back again, and he withdrew himself. You know, when the Jews and Gentiles were coming together, he withdrew himself, so much so that the Bible says that Barnabas was also carried away with their dissimulation. In other words, he was influenced by Peter to withdraw himself. But the interesting thing is that Peter, in the great conference that happened in Jerusalem, I think around AD 50 or thereabouts, 49, 50, 51, I think around AD 50, roughly 17 years after Christ, you know, when they were saying, except to be circumcised after the law of Moses, you can't be saved and so forth. And when they got together to have this big conference about that, Peter was the first one that spoke up and said that that's not the case. And James and Paul and all the others gave a testimony about that as well. But Peter went back to this very event and said that he relates that, and this was around 50 AD, he relates the story about the vision that he saw and about preaching to Cornelius, even though he didn't mention Cornelius by name, about by his mouth that the Gentiles would receive remission of sins through the Christ and so forth. But then later on, he withdrew himself, like if it was 58 or thereabouts AD. 8 years later, then he kind of lapsed back again, you know, because he was afraid of the Jews and so forth and so on. So it's kind of a mixture. So, but you can see the separation, even at this particular time, 25 years after Christ died on the cross, that there was still this uncertainty about the acceptance of the Gentiles, about whether they had to be circumcised or not, because they were still teaching that. As a matter of fact, some had gone out from their own number to say that, and they said no. They said, if you receive this, it didn't come from us. And then they wrote that letter to those churches and said, no, you know, these 4 things about the don't eat the things strangled and the blood and fornication and those kind of things. Go ahead, Lloyd.
For a long time, I thought maybe Cornelius was a proselyte because he was well spoken of by the Jews. He gave much alms, and his prayers were heard by God. But if he had been a proselyte, he wouldn't have needed Peter to come and speak to him, would he? I mean, he'd be just like any other Jew. He would have been eligible to hear the gospel and obey it just like any other Jew.
I wanted to, yeah, that's an excellent point. Let me see if I can find that, because there was a statement that one of these guys made that, if I can find it, I can't remember.
In fact, they say he feared God, and he was a good report among all the nations of the Jews. The Jews didn't seem to like anybody except their own nation.
Exactly.
So that always made me wonder.
Exactly. Here's what, Lloyd, in answer to that, here's what Wayne Jackson said. I knew that one of these had spoken up. I couldn't remember which one it was. In verses 17 through 23, this is part of Jackson's comment. He says, the Holy Spirit spoke to the apostle, informing him that 3 men had been sent by the Lord on behalf of Cornelius, who was a righteous, God-fearing man, and who needed to hear the gospel. The expression God-fearing was a technical term for a Gentile who had renounced paganism but had not adopted circumcision nor become a proselyte. So that's the way he describes Cornelius. In other words, he was a Gentile. he had renounced heathenism or paganism, all these other gods and so forth. He was a God-fearing man. He was worshiping the true God, but he was not circumcised. He didn't go that far, what the Jews required. He had not become a proselyte, according to Jackson, to the Jewish religion.
And if he had been a proselyte, he would have been eligible. He could have heard the gospel and been baptized and received
Yeah.
it like any other
Exactly.
Jew would have been. They wouldn't have needed Peter to come.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
And it wouldn't have been the last part of the command to go into Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and uttermost parts of the world, because that uttermost parts of the world, which applies to Cornelius, would not have applied at that particular point in time. It might have been to somebody else, but not to him. Charlie?
Well, in 1 John 4:13, it says, "Hereby know we that we dwell in him and he in us, because he had given us of his Spirit."
Absolutely, absolutely. We have it, whether just in the Word or whether in conjunction with the Word, as we talked about before. We do have the Spirit dwelling in us, 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 6, and other places, Romans 8, absolutely, good point. Down about Cornelius relating the story there in verse 30, 4 days ago I was fasting until this hour, and at the 9th hour I prayed in my house, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and said, Cornelius, thy prayers heard, thine alms are had in remembrance in the sight of God. Send therefore to Joppa, and call hither Simon, whose surname is Peter. He's lodged in the house of one Simon, a tanner by the seaside, who, when he cometh, he shall speak unto thee. And then in verse 33, which kind of ends this section, immediately therefore I sent to thee, and thou hast well done that thou art come. Now therefore, so Cornelius is speaking, now therefore are we all here present before God to hear all things that are commanded thee of God. In other words, whatever God has told you to speak, we're here to hear it. And so he had gathered his family together, and many of his friends and so forth. So Peter begins the sermon there in verse 34. He had been convinced by this time that Gentiles were accepted, because notice the statement that he makes in verse 34. Peter opened his mouth and said, so he's speaking to Cornelius, his household, others of Cornelius' friends, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. He had to have some convincing about it, but now he's convinced. It took him a little while. Now, he lapsed back, as we said, a number of years later there, because he was, I guess, afraid of some of the ones, the Jews and so forth. But here, he's very firm that the God is no respecter of persons. And just the last thought, verse 35, in every nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Now, of course, the aspect of working righteousness carries with it the idea of obedience, works righteousness. We would say, he that believeth is baptized shall be saved, repent and be baptized for the remission of sins. So the phrase there, works righteousness, carries with it the idea that there's something for man to do, and of course that has to do with an obedient faith that we talk about. It's talked about in Romans 1 and other places as well. The obedience of faith that Keith had mentioned when we were studying Romans a while back. All right, guys, thank you very much for your good attention. We really appreciate it. We'll take up there about verse 34, 35 next week.